It is a very, very complex world, global security environment we're facing right now. And we've got to be up to that challenge, because if we're perceived as weak, or we're perceived as unable as a nation to handle any of the challenges that come along, they will surely come our way.
These days, the men and women who make up our Guard and Reserve forces are more integrated into Department of Defense missions around the world than ever before. In fact, they're usually indistinguishable from those who've chosen the military as a full-time career. And like their active duty counterparts, they spend more and more time away from home, families, and friends, and they face the same dangers. But it hasn't always been that way. In all the years the United States has had an all-volunteer force, which dates back to July 1st, 1973, when the Nixon administration and Congress allowed the authority for the draft to lapse, never has there been a time when our Guard and Reserve forces played as large a role in our military operations as they do today. But in those days, the designated role for the reserve components was very different.
It was truly a strategic reserve. We had the Guard and Reserve there in case we had a major conflict. We would call them up. We'd have plenty of time to train them. And the imperative to be ready and have the same equipment was not there. And there wasn't anything wrong with that. It's just the imperative we had.
What we advertised was 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks in the summer. That's all we asked. And that's what was expected. We were not going to mobilize and go to war unless, you know, the Russians came across the Fulda Gap, and we were going to be the strategic reserve. So we were going to have plenty of time before we were needed to mobilize, to train, to get organized, before we were ever going to get employed.
But some reservists recall a sense of disappointment during their early years of service.
We had organizations that had no idea what they was doing. They was looking for 14 days annual training, which was in most cases a big party, and 2 days a month.
Command Sergeant Major Caffey served in Vietnam, and his expectations for the reserve were different from the reality he found when he reported for duty.
To me, it was insulting. I come from active component to a reserve component that was basically a social group.
At the time, the reserves were just that, a force held in reserve, there just in case the worst-case scenarios of the day happened. As a result, the priorities for both training and equipping the force were much different from today.
Now, back then, you've got the leftovers from the regular Army. We had the old uniforms, the old boots. Everything was handed down that was de-exed from the regular Army to include the equipment. It was really outdated.
Meanwhile, for men and women serving in the National Guard, the story was much the same.
The National Guard was under-equipped. Remember, before September 11th, it was a strategic reserve. The nation made a strategic decision to accept risk and not equip the Guard fully. We were going to fight a different kind of force on a different kind of timetable. It was a conventional fight. We had plenty of time under that old model, the old Cold War model, to call up the Guard, equip the Guard, fill out their formations, give them some training, and then ultimately send them in the latter stages of the operation to reinforce the active duty force.
Things started to change during the Reagan era with more equipment, better training opportunities. And then, of course, Desert Shield, Desert Storm came about, and there was a mass call-up of the reserves for the first time since Korea.
And as our forces continue to arrive, they can look forward to the support of the finest reserve components in the world. We are activating those special categories of reservists that are essential to completing our mission. The United States considers its reserve forces to be an integral part of the total military command.
But it was a call-up many reservists hadn't expected.
It was a huge surprise to the Army Reserve soldiers because we had been told we would never go anywhere, and then when actuality hit and we deployed, many of them were in just total shock.
Nearly 228,000 men and women from our reserve components were mobilized during Operations Desert Shield and Storm, and some 106,000 served in the Kuwait Theater of Operations.
Desert Shield, Desert Storm was a catalytic event in one way because it gave us an opportunity to check to see where we were successful over the past 15 years of non-usage and where we had some shortcomings. In some cases, some units were very ready. Aviation units, by and large, because they do their mission on a daily basis. If you're flying an aircraft, you have to be able to fly it every day, whether you're a reserve or active component. Infantry battalions, however, have suffered a greater challenge because, unlike aviation units, they didn't do their mission every day. They were more the traditional weekend drilling reservist, and they were multi-sited, so a battalion commander might have to travel to 4 or 5 different sites just to see all of his company commanders.
I think Desert Storm was a test of our ability to mobilize the force and deploy it. But what it did not test is our capability to sustain it.
In the years following the Gulf War, the use of Guard and Reserve forces continued, particularly in support of operations monitoring the no-fly zones over Iraq. In those operations, the United States Air Components had the lead role. Air Guard and Reserve people and hardware played a part.
We were using the Air Expeditionary Force to field our air forces for Operations Northern Watch and Southern Watch through the mid to late 90s, and we were cycling our people in these AEFs.
As the turn of the century approached, the no-fly zone operations continued, with no end in sight. The media came up with new labels they linked to the operations, such as the Forgotten War and the Long War. Then, on September 11, 2001, the unthinkable event that changed our world forever. In the days and weeks following the 9/11 attacks, thousands of Guard and Reserve forces were mobilized. They helped safeguard our ports, patrolled our skies, beefed up security at military bases and airports throughout the country. Meanwhile, U.S. leaders began to plan, because one thing the attacks made obvious was that the fight in our future would be nothing like those of the past. Coming up, our reserve components truly become part of America's total force.
That morning was a signal, a sign, a dramatic shot heard around the world, so to speak, that changed the National Guard from a strategic reserve to an operational force on no notice.
On October 7, 2001, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom, the military's part in the global war on terrorism.
Where's that fire coming from?